Hello and welcome to Pods Like Us. I'm Martin Corbell, known to my friends as Marv, and this time I'm speaking with Jared Carter, who is the, shall I use the phrase, genius behind the fantastic podcast Desert Skies. I've probably embarrassed him now by saying that.
Indeed.
Which is, well, we'll let him explain that to us. Hey, Jared, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me. I'm so excited to be able to talk to you. I've listened to the show a few times and I love your voice. If I ever do allow other voices into the show, you could always play a fantastic interviewer, I think.
Thank you very much. I don't know whether anyone's noticed, but that is a different microphone to usual. I've changed microphones now today. So I'm using a condenser microphone as opposed to my old SM58 that I used to use that's down there at the moment.
I'm running an Audio Technica something. I have no idea.
But this has more power to it as well because it's got its own amplifier as well. The microphone has. So there you go.
Wow. Sounds like you know your microphones. I have no idea. I'm really terrible at this stuff. If I'm being honest, I don't know anything.
I trained as a sound engineer
years
and years ago.
Nice.
So I've got all sorts of equipment and microphones and all sorts all over. So actually, here we go. I'll actually let you describe the show for people that might not have heard the show before.
Yeah. Desert Skies is a gas station in the afterlife that lies between the physical plane, the plane that we're in now, and the next plane of existence, which we don't really know anything about in the show. So you die on the physical plane, you arrive in the astral plane, and it's the job of those who work at the Desert Skies gas station to prepare you for your journey through the astral plane, through the celestial spheres, so that you can make it safely into the next life, whatever that might be.
Well, it's definitely very original and incredibly creative. So what made you actually think about the show? Where did the idea come from? Even though before we were chatting, I know that your family has a history with gas stations. So was that an inspiration?
No, not at all, because I only found out about that, I want to say in the last week that my great grandfather on my mom's side owned a gas station in, I believe it's Stanfield, Arizona. So for those who are familiar with Arizona, somewhere between Phoenix and Tucson. And that gave me chills. Just the picture of the gas station, and you can find it on my website, desertskiespodcast.com. It's almost exactly the station that's on the album art that I envisioned for Desert Skies. So yeah, pretty fascinating. But I think it came from a few different places. Anybody who grew up in the type of area that I grew up in, it's very desolate. It's very isolated, and depending on where you are, and where I was, it certainly was just in the middle of the Sonoran Desert for years growing up. You find the desert to be a bit of a magical place. I think in part because it's so, I allude to this in the show, but it's so dangerous. I don't understand why people live in the desert in particular, but I've come to love and appreciate it a lot over the years. The fact that you kind of have this ecosystem that's hell-bent on hurting you in some way, whether it's a cactus or a scorpion. We have some of the most painful in the world here. Spiders, rattlesnakes. It's all out there. There's not a whole lot of what people would consider natural beauty in the classical sense, but it you come to appreciate it and you come to see it and you start to miss it when you're away from it, and especially at night. I feel like there's just something magical and mystical about the desert. Um, that's kind of commingled with, as soon as I could drive, one of my favorite things to do was to get in the car and just go. I love getting lost. There was a time in my life when I didn't have a cell phone, or when I did, there wasn't a lot of coverage area. There were still places where you could get lost. And so just driving out into the desert and visiting ghost towns and doing all these different things and just wondering, like, how am I going to get home, or am I on someone's personal property, whatever. It's just something, there's just something kind of magical and exciting about it. And one of the things that you come across a lot, and less so now, is old gas stations in Arizona. And I think there is something about a gas station, an older gas station off the side of an empty road, lit up only from the inside and with a little neon on the outside, that is just beautiful and mysterious and kind of scary. And we actually lived in a place where there was a gas station like that. And I remember driving by it one time at night, and I just thought, if there was any way that I could support a family and work here overnight, this would be my job. It, the different people you get to meet driving down the freeway, and the type of odd characters, that's another piece that I think inspired it. Was I worked at a hotel overnight. One of my first real jobs was working overnight in a hotel, a Comfort Inn. And the type of people who show up at a hotel at 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, midnight, are a different breed of people. They're strange. And I think people would say I'm a little strange, and we just got along famously well. And so there's something about this podcast where it was, and I toyed around with making it a horror podcast, which it certainly is not by any means. But I saw that was so popular, and there was this part of me that's like, well, I want people to listen to my show if I'm going to make one. It ended up absolutely not being that, because I wanted to make something that I would enjoy making. And what I wanted to make was a place that I could live in my mind. And not to just keep rambling on, but that's probably been my favorite piece of feedback that I get from folks ever so often, is I just like living there. Yeah. I just like listening and imagining that I'm there, like that's their getaway place, and it's mine too. And so it's cool to be able to know that I'm sharing in that with people.
Well, it's definitely got a comforting feel to it when I listen to it. Like you said, there's no horror involved in it at all, really. It is, like you said, like I said, it's comfortable listening. It's sort of like, okay, it's about a subject that some people in different circumstances, or looked at another way, it could be seen as a bit of a sad sort of show if you were taking it from another angle, because it's about people who've passed away and then they're in this place. But it's not taken that way at all. There is, like I said, there's a calmness to it and a almost like a friendly feel to it when I listen to it.
Yeah, that was one of the things I think that surprised me. I think that I believe that I'm being a lot more intense than I actually am. Yeah. So when I was in social situations, oftentimes I'll leave and I'll ask my wife, what do I need to apologize for? What did I say? I feel like I was coming off really strong. And she's like, what are you hearing yourself say like, no, you're fine, you were really you were really nice to people. So maybe there's just a fear of like displeasing people in that way. I'm not sure. I'll have to think about that. uh but I think for one of the things that was really surprising to me was when people started telling me that they listened to the show to fall asleep. And that actually upset me a little bit at first. I'm like, wow, so my show is so boring that people feel like they can put it on and just drift off. But then as I've gotten more feedback from people over time, they do find it in a lot of cases supremely comforting. And even to the extent where I was surprised by this, folks who say that it's just helped to not entirely remove, but help them to overcome a lot of their fear of death that they had. I don't think that's because they're looking at the show as, well, this is exactly what happens. I don't think there's anyone who listens and goes, well, I'm showing up at this gas station. Maybe statistically there is one or two people who really believe that, and if they form their own religion, I'd be happy to visit their church at some point in time. But I think for most people it's simply exposure therapy, because it's something that we don't talk about unless we see death being treated either in an extremely unimportant way, like in a John Wick film or something similar, or we see it not being discussed at all because we don't like to think about the fact that we're going to die. And so having something that kind of gently helps to remind people of that without making it feel scary, because I don't think it should be scary. It's just really, that's been encouraging. It's more than I could have hoped for, I think, in that regard.
So were you already inspired by other shows to go into writing a podcast then, specifically an audio drama?
I don't know that there is one specific show, but I have always been a consumer of all kinds of media and stories. And so I think some combination of everything that I've loved over the course of my life has somehow managed to make Desert Skies what it is. Things like Cheers, the show Cheers, just the familiarity of and the love and the camaraderie mixed with some tension and conflict at different points. X-Files, huge. Twilight Zone, in terms of the different monster of the week kind of thing that we deal with. So there's so much, and then I've heard other people say it reminds them of some things that I'm not even terribly familiar with, such as Red Dwarf is one that comes up quite a bit. Have you seen Red Dwarf? Would you recommend it?
I would recommend it. Yes. Yep.
I'll have to check that out at some point. And then somebody, it's funny because they're actually from England, said, oh no, they would not be happy that I said that. I think I have misplaced them. Where are they from? I can't remember. Forgive me if they hear this. I'm not even going to tell you the story because then they don't know.
Okay.
They don't know who they are.
I'll have to edit that out.
Yeah, I'll edit that part out. I remember them getting offended, but I can't remember why. No. Where do you think, if they got offended, where do you think they were from? If you had to guess.
I don't know. Not a clue. I don't want to offend offend anybody to say anything.
No, definitely edit that part out. Okay. So
what's this one? Oh, interesting. Was it Cold Spot Paranormal Research? They've actually sent, I think this is for you, where they've said, if you could visit anywhere on Earth, where would you visit? Laws of physics need not apply.
Wow.
That's an interesting question.
That is a brilliant question.
Also, how does it fit in with the show? But it's an interesting question.
Yeah, I don't know. I suppose I would want to visit the home that I was telling you about prior
Yeah.
to the show, our family home, the Carter home in Bedfordshire. Uh, believe it's called Box End House. It's behind a horse feed store. I think it's a private property, so I'm not sure how laws of physics would apply. But if I could visit that house without having to disturb the people who actually occupy it now, I would like to. I'd like to see. Everybody wants to know where they come from. You know.
They do. They do.
Yeah.
But, I've done that where I've gone back to places where I lived as a child, and we've just gone to see what the area is like.
Oh, I've done
And
that. Isn't it interesting to see how much, I don't know if it's the same in your case, but in my case, a lot of things had changed.
yes, well, about a month or two after we'd been to one of the places, they actually demolished it and it became somewhere completely different. The whole street and the whole estate that it was on was demolished within 2 months
Wow.
after we'd been there to look at it. So we're lucky enough just to be able to go there and catch it just before then. But
Hmm.
yes, everything was bigger when I was a child and everywhere smaller when I went there to visit. And there's no way this house was that small.
I know. Oh my gosh, that is so true.
So
That is so true.
it's like chocolate bars were bigger as a kid. So show history. So did you have an idea when you so do you have a how far ahead are you with the stories that you're writing? And is there a long game, shall we say?
Yes and no. I would say I know I have the last episode in my head almost word for word at this point. Just I've played it over and over and over again, and I've kind of written backwards from there to some degree. Is how do I make what's happening now interesting, but make sure that I arrive there. So I think a lot in terms of endings. One of the things um, one of the things that was really big for me when I was a kid was writing stories in my head to music, and so I'd buy soundtracks a lot on cassette, and then I probably had a few vinyl soundtracks. Indiana Jones was one of them, I think. Star Wars, a few of these different. The Haunted Mansion theme from Disneyland. Um, Truman Show later on like CD and different things. But anyways, I would listen to those on repeat, and I would just write stories in my head to the music, and I would try to match the story to the music, so that I could produce some sort of like emotional response. I'm one of those people who gets goosebumps, depending on how like a movie lands on that really emotional scene. Um, and so I would try to produce that effect in my room with my headphones on. It was really addictive. And so from the very beginning, I think endings are incredibly important. I'm probably not going to be, if there's a really artsy person that I'm engaging with who really is a huge fan of everything depressing and um doesn't really arrive anywhere in terms of story. It just kind of makes you think, or it looks good or whatever. I'm not going to be able to connect with them in a real way, because I like good endings, and not necessarily purely happy endings either, but it should. I grew up I'm just going down so many rabbit holes, but I grew up very poor at different points. And when you go to see a movie, that can be a huge, that's the thing that you do.
Yeah.
You don't go on vacations like all your other friends are doing. You don't, travel to Europe or whatever. You watch movies, and that's the same across all socioeconomic demographics. And to pay money for a movie and to drive to another town to see it, and then to be met with an ending that's unsatisfying, um to me, in my mind, in my context, is is a crime. And so I had to know what the ending of the show would be and what the ending of this current season would be. So I have the ending of the show planned, which is it could be 2-3 years out from now. And then I have the ending of the season planned, and just making sure that I can get there in a way that, oh my gosh, I have heart palpitations sometimes because I'll read reviews of shows where the listeners will say, I loved this show until the very last episode, and then it felt like they just had to do something with the show to close it out, like they had not thought about it at all. That is my biggest fear. And so apart from that, I don't often know what's going to happen in the very next episode. It's kind of a practice. I try to write myself into a corner at the end of each episode, so that, because I know that if I can write myself in a corner, I have to find an interesting way of getting out of that, which means that the listener is going to find it interesting, which will hopefully keep them listening into the future. And then it's also just a fun exercise for me as a writer, is how do I make this work? Because sometimes it feels like it's really not going to.
Well, you're in good company there, because to use an example, I don't know how much for Star Trek, how much you know about Star Trek, but in Star Trek: The Next Generation, they had a very famous two-parter, and part one of Best of Both Worlds was the end of one season, and then part two was the beginning of the next season. And behind the scenes, they were saying that they wrote the first part as a cliffhanger, but then the problem that they had was that they had to bring it back for the next season, but they hadn't actually thought about what was going to happen in the second part. And Captain Picard had been made into a Borg from a human, and they had to work out, well, how are we going to get him back to being human, and how is this going to happen, and this, that, and the other. And it ended up being a standout two-part episode. But it was because of the fact that they were thinking, and they had to think on the feet, how do we get out of this, as they were getting closer to starting to film the next season. So sometimes it can work.
I think I mean, I have some really brilliant friends who have made much better shows than mine, arguably, I think far better. And they plan things out sometimes years in advance. They'll have their entire show completely written. I think there's got to be something about that that's really comforting for them, because you're not figuring this out in front of people. I feel like I'm figuring this out in front of people, which is very, very scary. And so I envy those who can do that. For me, especially as someone who's not an experienced writer, I feel like I have to do this, because otherwise I might be prone to make something more formulaic, or I might be prone to purely draw from a story that I'm already really familiar with. I watch a lot of horror films, and I was watching one with my son. He's of the age now where I know he'll sleep through the night if he watches some of them with me. And he likes to ask questions. He doesn't do it anymore, because he would say, what do you think? What do you think is going on? And because I'd seen so many, I could tell him the end of the movie. This happened just recently. We were watching a TV show, same thing. And that's not because of any fault of the show so much. It's just I watch too much and I listen to too much. So if I didn't write myself into these really hard places, it would be very hard for me to get out into the next episode without falling into some familiar trope. And so the bad side of that is you can really make something that's so outlandish that it's terrible. And it's like I tell people, if you think you're prone to making something really, really strange, make it really strange in the very first episode so that people don't get whiplash later. I did something really strange in my first episode, which has allowed me to do whatever I want since then to kind of get me out of difficult situations.
Well, it helps that you're talking about, the in between, the stopover between this life and the next. Essentially, that helps matters, because there you can go anywhere essentially, because it's going to be strange no matter what.
I think I didn't even realize how fun it would be. Like I don't know that um I don't know that I could have done it any other way, but it's so much fun to be able to create a world. And you create boundaries, and you do have to end up sticking to your own boundaries once you've created them. But the astral plane,
Yeah.
in particular, which has so many different definitions in different contexts, and I who knows, I may have offended someone who has a deeper understanding of the actual astral plane than I do at some point, but by just creating it the way that I wanted to, um, it's been a blast. And even within the silliness, I try to make sure that it's not too outlandish,
Yeah.
which is which some people might find ludicrous if they've listened to the show, but at least in my mind, it's not so far out there. Um, but yeah, there's so much freedom, and I love that aspect of it.
One of these days, you might come across another character who knows what Wei is talking about, other than Mac, the mechanic.
Yeah, that would be
Yeah.
something for sure. For sure. That I think I only recently realized that that was probably at least in part inspired by the coyote from an episode of The Simpsons where you I don't know if you're familiar with this one where he eats the chili pepper and he hallucinates.
Yes. Yeah.
One of my favorite episodes, and now that I look back, I'm like, that's way.
That is a classic Simpsons episode. That one.
It's so good. It's so
Yeah.
good.
Yeah. Shout out to my friend who does the Docast. He actually, when I had him on my show, he was saying that that was one of his standout favorite episodes.
Really? Oh, that's
Yes.
awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's in good company.
So when you're recording, then you've scripted. Am I going to go there yet? So I had something else in mind, and then suddenly, yep. So we'll carry on with this then. So how do you record the show then? The audio that you record, and then the music that you've got. The music is so cool. It's very synth based, very, and also the sound effects as well. Are they all yourself? The sound effects, the music, and then of
No.
course that the voices are all you as well. So how do you get all this? And where did you source it from? And how do you then put the show together? That's a big question.
There's a few different things. For the music, I am nowhere near musically talented enough to create all of it. I look for it, and in some cases, against the better of my budget, if a song just fits really well, I'll pay for the license to have it on the show. It's to give kind of a full picture. Generally, when I finally get into the headspace where I'm able to work, I'm a remarkably anxious person. Sometimes the show takes longer between episodes just because I'm not thinking about it. I'm like, I don't want to screw this up. I like my show, and I like that people like it, and I don't want to mess it up. And if I don't touch it, then they're happy all the way up until episode 10, right? I don't have to worry about it. So when I get in the headspace where I'm able to work on it, I will work on it. And so it might take 3 or 4 days to make an episode. And that's all I'm doing. I'll spend one day writing up until I reach the point of conflict. Like I write myself into a little bit of a hole halfway through a script, or into a wall rather, a corner. And then the next day I sleep on it and try not to think about it as much as I can. I'll go outside at night and just listen to music for hours on end and just kind of hope that answer comes to me. And then the next day I'll work myself out of it. And once I'm done writing, the following day, I will wake up and I'll go through and I'll read and edit, really think about like, oh my gosh, am I messing something up here with the existing lore of the show? Once I feel really comfortable with that, I'll record that same day. Generally record about 2 hours worth of audio. Since I'm doing all the voices for the show, a lot of people ask, like, do you record them all at once and just kind of like change back and forth? It would make it a nightmare in editing later if I were to do that. Plus, I really feel like I got to get in the headspace of the person that I'm performing as. I think I could do it. I think it wouldn't be as good. So I'll record all of those differently or at different times. um, or on different tracks rather. And once I'm done with that, Mac is always the last voice because he destroys my voice. Once I've
Yeah.
done Mac, I can't generally record anymore that same day if I needed to. Um, and so once I've got that recorded, I'll usually start editing all of the audio. I'll start going through each track and removing all the parts where I messed up or the voice changed or whatever. Sometimes it's so bad I'm sorry, excuse me. Sometimes it's so bad that I'll have to my wife will listen to it. I look to her for all of my feedback. She is like my most trusted source, and it's because she's a terrible liar.
Yeah.
It would be almost impossible for her to say this is great without me going, you're lying. Which is probably not great for her. It's probably a lot of pressure, but I'm thankful for it because sometimes she'll say, you know what, this just doesn't work. Um, and then I go, well, I said I was going to release it on Monday. And she's like, okay, then just release it the way it is. And I go, no, I can't do that. I have to change it now. And I'm always so thankful for it because then I get to look back and go, wow, she was so right. So that happens pretty rarely, but it does happen where I will have to re-record an entire voice. But for the most part, just editing things out. By the time I'm done, I'm usually left with about 20 minutes to 23 minutes worth of dialogue, total dialogue.
Yep.
And then the next day, I will spend that day adding sound effects. This is for certain sound effects, I'll license them through like a monthly licensing with a company called Envato.
Yep.
Just because there's things that I wouldn't trust myself to make without it just being a ton of work, and I'm already low enough on resources just being the only person making this. Some though I will do myself because sometimes you can't find a sound effect that really works for the show, and that can be fun. Usually simple things, rustling papers, like bumping a guitar into something, just little things. The music is, to me, the most important part. And because I'm not writing the music myself,
Yep.
I have to find something that works within the existing story. And there's probably a smarter way of going about that. I don't know. But let's say that I'm having a conversation between uh, two characters, Tindy and a traveler, and there's different things happening during that conversation. Maybe it starts out with a small amount of conflict leading into some emotion, leading into a monologue that is ultimately and sometimes going to lead to the resolution for the characters in the show.
Yep.
So then I will listen to hundreds of tracks until I find the right one. And then oftentimes I'll have to re-edit parts of the track to make it work. When it works really well. Like one of the parts that one of the pieces, which is actually like 3 songs mixed together, is, and I don't think this is a huge spoiler alert for anyone, but there's an episode that features a rock labyrinth and 2 characters walking through it. And it's supposed to give you like sort of a contemplative feel, start building up some interest and emotion. And then whenever they reach the center of the rock labyrinth, they look up and they see the stars. And I lived at a ranch for a while. I was a cook, and we had a rock labyrinth on a mountain. It was a very desolate place, and to see the stars in that area is a truly magical experience if you've grown up in a city. I had a friend from New York who visited, and he did not know that you could see the Milky Way. Like that's how brilliant the stars were in this place, covering every inch of the sky. And that's a holy moment. That's one of those experiences everyone should have in their life. So trying to find a way to communicate that through music, um, it was really important to me to get that right. I'll tell you, by the time I'm done listening to different music, I want to die. I want to go outside and step in front of a bus, just because
Yeah.
there are so many songs out there, and listening to the first 3 seconds of 1,000 of them is enough to drive a man insane. But when it works, when it finally works, it's such a great feeling.
Well, it definitely worked in that episode because that was one of my favorite standout episodes. Personally, I loved it. You know, and it was just so moving. And you're right. When you get to that thing where where Mac just suddenly says, "Well, look up," and
Mm,
then the music and the whole emotion of the whole thing just worked perfectly. And then there was the great bit at the end where Tendi realizes that, you know, Mac was right to actually do it that way as well, and everything. It was just
mm,
such a magical episode to listen to. Like you said, you know, it's comforting.
mm. Yeah, yeah. Well, thank you for saying that. I'm glad that you enjoyed it, and I've been um every episode, and I'm sure any other creator who's listening to this, and you've probably experienced it yourself. Uh, if you really want to make something good, if you're one of those folks who gets hung up on creating this perfect experience for people, then every episode that you make will always be your worst episode that you've made until someone tells you otherwise. And at least in my case, it often takes me months of people saying, no, this episode really meant a lot to me. That was one of those episodes. I'd say episodes 1 through 10, and there's only 10 right now. That's happened in each of those episodes where I walk away and I go, I just made the worst thing, the worst thing possible. This last week, somebody won a trivia that we had, and that was the script. They got like an autographed script that I'd used to record. That was the script that they requested, and there's still a part of me that goes, why? Um, but those of us who are insecure in in our art, I'm sure, can relate to that to some extent.
You've led into another question that someone else has sent in. Somebody follows your account very closely, I think, with this. So this is called, what is it, Canadian Spirit Podcast.
Mm,
And they
I
said,
like them. I
yes,
interact with them a lot on Twitter. They're fun.
they've said, how do you deal with the anxiety that your art won't be received well? Or do you experience this at all? Yes, you do. I
I
know
do.
that. I know that because I've seen your Twitter messages. But
Yes.
yeah. So how do you deal with that if you do deal with it?
I think that I think that I do deal with it better sometimes than I do at other times. I I talk a lot about mental health. I'm glad to see more people are talking about it. It's become not such a taboo topic, and it plays a huge part in the creation of this show and in each episode. For me, in 2018, I really had to come to terms with my own mental health challenges, and I'd spent a couple decades not dealing with that type of anxiety around performance in particular. I was not dealing with that anxiety well in healthy ways. Um, Now I think the way that I deal with it is being open and honest about it. Um, Trying not to speak negatively to myself. Sometimes I go back and I look at some of the messages that people have sent. You know what they say, how 100 people can say a nice thing and one person can say a mean thing, and you zero in on that one person um who said the negative thing. So sometimes I go back and I'll read a handful of those messages which have been most meaningful to me. It's so funny. I don't think people realize, at least I never thought this. Um I think sometimes people think that they're bothering a creator when they send them a message,
Yeah.
or and obviously I think any of us could take those to unhealthy places, but when someone takes the time to just write a nice review or send an email, um depending on the day, depending on the context of your life in that moment, sometimes those messages just hit at just the right time. And
Yeah.
they're usually scared about um gushing and going on and on. But sometimes you as a creator, like, if you didn't think it would be weird, you would gush back and just be like, you have no idea how much I needed to hear this
Yeah.
today. And it really does in a lot of cases. Um, Especially for those uh who the show has truly helped, which is again shocking to me in a lot of ways. Um, one of my friends said that their 8-year-old struggles with a lot of anxiety, and that when given the opportunity to listen to the show or to play Minecraft, he'll choose to listen to the show, which I think, if anybody knows Minecraft, like that's a huge compliment. And I think about that, and I think about um that 8-year-old is so anxious, and the show helps him, and I'm anxious,
Yeah.
and we're both anxious, and it's anxiety producing for me to make the show, and it's anxiety producing for him to not know what's going to happen next, and that can help to push me into gear and say, come what may, I'm going to get this next episode out, because there's people who are depending on it.
Well, we're going to use that episode that we'd already spoken about with the, when they looked up, into the
Mm-hmm.
sky. So he was looking at the rocks on the floor, and then he looked up, and that as one of these examples where very often in your show, in fact, I'd say every episode, almost every episode, probably, you're touching on, because the different people that come to the station, they all have different forms of anxiety or some sort of mental health problem that is causing them a problem with going to that next, to the next place or the next
Mm-hmm.
plane. Um, and and then the characters of Tendi or Mac, they help with that situation, and it's almost, is it you actually looking at these subjects and thinking, well, this is a way that this can be looked around? Is it almost like a look into yourself, essentially,
Mm.
and sort of saying to yourself, okay, this is how I could get around. This is how I could look at this from a different angle and try and work out those problems.
I think Desert Skies is probably the most thinly veiled self therapy that
Yes.
anyone has ever produced. And my wife is, because she's so familiar with the things that I'm afraid of and the stuff in my own past and whatnot, my shortcomings, that when she listens to the show, she knows exactly what I'm referring to. One of the things that surprised me when I started to talk about my own mental health challenges back in 2019 was how many people reached out that I would have never thought, folks I had known my entire life, who reached out and said, that's exactly what I'm dealing with. It's amazing how powerful stigma is, and the extent to which the folks that I talked to had lived with their own mental illness or mental health challenges and had never told anybody. It felt so sacred to hear that from people, that I'm going to tell you because you told me. And there's something really cool about that. It also helped me to realize there's nothing that I'm experiencing that is unique to me. Either a large portion of people have experienced or are experiencing the same thing, or they know someone who is. And so I never wanted the show to be preachy because I don't have all the answers. And I think that's in part why all the characters are, even when they're good, they're flawed. Um, but a big part of it was I've spent a lot of time thinking through these things. That episode in particular, I've spent a lot of time trying to climb the corporate ladder because I felt like I needed to be somebody. And and right after the last big corporate job that I did, the next place I was at was the ranch with the Rock Labyrinth. And you don't have cell phone reception most of the time when you're out there, and you're just kind of forced to look up at the stars. And it felt like I could breathe for the first time. And so, though I wouldn't consider myself that character, the extent to which he's a hothead isn't really the way that I operate. But that sense of I have to be somebody, and I look tough and I look well put together on the outside, but inside, I'm stressed, I'm overwhelmed, and I just need somebody to tell me to take a deep breath and look up. And so that, yeah, almost every single episode, I think the only one that doesn't really have that, not to cheapen my own show, have you ever seen Full House, the
No,
American sitcom
no,
from the
never seen
90s?
Full House. No,
Full
I
House
wish
is
I
well
had.
known. If you've seen one, you've seen many of them, because they all follow a very similar format, which is um, they build up through comedy to a very emotional ending. And I think it's part of why my show is effective with some people, and a big part of why their show was so effective, um, at least for the demographic that it was trying to reach, which is when you put humor in the same house as deeply emotional
Yeah.
issues and conflicts and challenges, something about the humor makes the deeper part more powerful. And yeah, so that happened in almost every episode, but I think episode 6, I believe it is, with the Canadian twins, which I loved making that episode because that one to me felt the most like a Twilight Zone episode.
Yeah.
Someone reached out to me over via email the very next day and said, and I love this person, they've been very encouraging otherwise. But they said, I was so disillusioned by this episode. They said, are you just going to become every other show out there? And I was kind of mad. I kind of, I wrote a response back that's like, don't judge the show based on one episode. Like I don't have to satisfy something in you. My wife, I bring her up a lot. Her name's Trish. She's my favorite person. She calls it shaking a tissue box, which is
Hey,
something I think
Trish.
she learned from someone else. Yeah. But she like that. But she calls it shaking your tissue box in other people's faces. And I think there was a part of me in that moment that was like, hey, I wanted to make something fun to, that would help move the story forward. Don't shake your tissue box in my face. Just let me make funny Canadian accents. Not that Canadian accents are funny, Canadians, Canadian spirit. I love you guys. You don't sound like that. But yeah.
So these voices then that you make, number one, if anybody's people who are listening now, those people that listen to the show already, you will realize that the character of Tendi is the closest to your natural voice of any of the characters. Is there a reason why you picked that? Is he sort of like you in that way? Or is there another reason why you've done that? And then you made all these characters have these different voices. And why are they all you? Is it because you need to do that, or
because I can't afford it?
can't get anybody else to do the voices?
No. So a lot like Tendi, I'm very controlling. Not in terms of like if I'm with somebody, I'm like, I'm going to tell you exactly what to do, but I want to control the outcome of whatever it is that I'm doing or whatever it is that I'm making. And because I have that vision in my head of the way that it ends up, and I'm worried that if I were to invite other people into that it might not end up the way that I want it to. Part of that is probably just I don't want to have to give people feedback. It's more
Yep.
of a me problem. And I think most voice actors that I know are very open to, I've become friends with a lot of them. They're very open to receiving notes. I just don't like to give them. And also, um, in terms of what I alluded to earlier, I make the show very quickly.
Yep.
And the idea of having to wait, there's always a chance that I'm going to dip into a low that makes it difficult to complete the episode or go through another period of time that's just not really helpful. I really got to take advantage of those times. Um, and one of the ways I can guarantee that I can reduce my anxiety, this again goes back to that question, I guess, a little bit, is by not having to interact with people. As horrible as that sounds, I love you, people, but you are my biggest source of anxiety, and I'm sure I am somebody's biggest source of anxiety.
The interesting thing is, so we've just been joined by Darren from My Guest List Pod, who's a great friend of both of us. Hey, Darren.
Hey guys, how are you? I hope you can hear me fine.
We
We
can.
can.
We can. Yep. After
Um,
your long journey.
ver-
So you're speaking with Jared. Both me and Darren have actually also been done voices for audio dramas as well. So we know, sort of to a lesser degree, we understand where you're coming from with the voice thing.
Well, if it first off, Darren, I love interacting with you on Twitter, and I'm so thankful that you enjoy the show. It's always really encouraging. Um, but
Pleasure, not a problem.
next season, I have said, and I have always intended for hopefully, I mean, it's not a spoiler that's essential to the plot, but I have always intended for a bus to just show up at the station, which would make no sense and would throw a wrench in all kinds of things. And I would just love for that bus to be full of all of my voice actor friends. And I have many since I started this podcast, made so many friends with so many talented people. And the idea of all of them showing up at once in one episode just is such a pleasure to me. I look really forward to doing that. We'll just knock it all out at once.
So
That's funny. That's
yeah. How did you come up with all of these voices then, Jared? Have you always been able to have these different voices, or was it something that's come about because of the show?
It's a two-parter, I think. I've always when I was a kid, like a ton of kids, I just would copy the cartoon voices and different things that I would hear. And the more that people encouraged me to do it, uh, the more I wanted to do it. And so that was part of it. Listening to songs in the car. I used to make a game because when you live in the desert, there's a lot of driving. Um, there's a lot of driving and a lot of in between spaces. And so listening to music and trying to match the voice of the person that you're listening to the point that you can't hear your own voice anymore. It just sounds like the voice that you're listening to in a song has gotten louder or richer. That was just something that I did. I don't know if anybody else does that, but I thought that was really, really fun. And then lastly, to some small degree, it's the way that I've dealt with anxiety when talking to people. So I'll oftentimes mimic the people that I'm talking to in some small ways. Kind of picking up on their cadence, picking up on their tone and inflection, and repeating that back to them. And it's not until I leave that someone will say, "Were you making fun of them?" And it's like, no, I wasn't making fun of them. I don't realize that I'm doing that most of the time. So voices have always been a thing. Audio, in a lot of ways, is just the way that a big way that I interact with the world. And so that played a part. In terms of the characters for the show, like you mentioned, Tendi is pretty much me, but I make him a little higher like this.
Yep.
So it's a little bit of a change, and it actually sounds a lot like a friend of mine that if I ever made fun of him behind his back, this is kind of what he'd sound like. It was a very easy voice for me to do. And let's see. Mac was Mac. First off, Mac is a real person.
Right.
Yeah, not too many people know this, but Mac is actually a family friend. He is probably 6'2", so he's not a short Mac. He doesn't have a full beard, but he has an amazing mustache. He's an older gentleman, a Vietnam vet, probably has no idea what an audio drama is and wouldn't be interested in ever listening to one. But some of Mac's characteristics were pulled from that. He is a very real life Mac, tends to delight in childlike play. So when my kids are doing something wrong around him, eating a dessert that they shouldn't be eating or whatever the case might be, he spurs them on as I tell them not to do things. And so that's like been born a lot into that character. Yeah. His voice is Mac's voice in real life is more like Dale Edwards, kind of like up here, which I didn't want Mac to be really, really old. And so I don't know where exactly I pulled Mac from as a voice. I think I've just had it there for a long time, but a lot of people have told me that it's Carl from Sling Blade. If you guys have seen the film Sling Blade, I like mustard with my biscuits, or whatever. And that's the way that I would do that voice when I was a kid. Yeah.
I actually didn't know that you did that just straight. I thought maybe you actually used something to create that voice. Like I didn't realize that you just did that straight off the bat naturally. That's pretty impressive. So you do Corson and Shirley and everybody. And
I do.
I assume not Weiwei, but
no.
but it's very impressive. And editing must be an absolute nightmare for you.
Sometimes, I mean, there's quite a few voices that I don't change a lot, and the ones that I use regularly, I have presets for.
Okay.
I try really hard to get to the voice that is the way that I want it, and then tweak it a little bit in terms of pitching and things afterwards. Because if I have to change it a lot, it'll sound very much like I'm changing it.
Like digital voice or something like that.
Yeah, especially with pitching.
Yeah. No, it's very impressive. It's very good.
Thank you. It's very fun.
And apologies for being late, guys. I'm actually about 250 k's out of Melbourne. I'm sitting in a McDonald's car park at the moment on the way to one of my customers. So I had to actually find somewhere I could sit and talk in the car and not look too strange, like too shady. So.
Well, I'm glad you're able to join us. What time is it where you are, Darren?
It's 11 past 9 in the morning.
Okay. So a little earlier in the day.
Yeah, I've been on the road since about 7:30 this morning. So
it's a long drive.
I'm away for 3 days at the moment, so it's all good.
So have we gone into the recording and mixing? Have we gone into that already? Yep, we have. So I don't know why I've put this down, number 7. I was thinking because of Darren, Darren does list. So I'm thinking of, have you got a list of what you think would be necessities in a service station, especially one that's, desert skies?
Well, if anybody, you're dead. You're dead already, and so live a little. There, you can't go in. I mean, if you go into a gas station today, and you're a grown up, you have to make decisions based on the wisdom of your years. You got to think, do I really want to eat this pickled food item? It might make me sick later. Well, you don't really have to worry about that in the astral plane. So I say, first and foremost, you need to just go hog wild. You're only visiting desert skies once. Try everything. And there's really nobody's pressuring you to move along quickly, just so long as you intend to move along. So if I was there at Desert Skies, I would want to try the pickled pig's feet, which induce devastating degrees of sadness. I don't know why they do that, but they do. Is there a deeper meaning? Like, are they magical? And induce the sadness, or do pickled pig's feet as a food item just I imagine pickled pig's feet are delicious. I don't know. Like, I recently made Guinness pie, and I made my own Trotter gear from pig's feet, and I thought it was wonderful. It added a depth of flavor. But I want to know, does this thing just make me incredibly sad? Because sometimes I think we don't allow ourselves to feel sadness. We just feel, we pretend like we're angry. So I just want to feel all the sad all at once. Maybe I can get it all out, and it would just be incredibly therapeutic. Terra Seraphic soda. Say that again.
Sorry, I'll write a song like Tristan.
Yeah, right. deal with your sadness that way. Terra Seraphic soda, which I've said is like cocaine in soda form. There was originally Shirley was supposed to, there's an episode 2 that I never shared. I wrote an entire episode 2 that would have taken the show in a remarkably different direction that I didn't know I'd be able to bring it back from. And there's a Shirley like character in that episode who has consumed all of the Terra Seraphic soda, and she's a very old lady, and she's hyped up on what is essentially the equivalent to cocaine.
Wow.
Yeah, so I'd like to try that, just knowing I'm not a drug guy, so I could at least experience what that's like one time when I know that it's safe and I can't hurt anybody. Apart from that, I think just gas stations in general. I used to say a gas station hot dog was an amazing thing, especially if you microwave the hot dog bun a little bit. But the last time that I took, my son wanted a hot dog from a local gas station, and I took him there, and a cockroach crawled out of the relish container. And so I think it just depends on where you are and how clean you feel the place is. Just be careful. I still think they're probably a really good food. And to be honest, there's probably cockroaches in the hot dog meat anyways. So just depending on how squeamish you are, give it a go. That's a big one. And for me, I love there's a pickled spicy sausage, Tijuana Mama, I think is what it's called. And I absolutely adore that. Anything salt and vinegar is always a good choice for a road trip.
Very good.
Yeah.
Jared, could I ask something? Why a Buick Skylark?
The year, in part just because of the story and when it's kind of taking place in some way. The Buick Skylark, I grew up in a lot of, we drove a lot of sedans, and Buick was one of them. Skylark in particular, I just liked the name.
Okay.
When I was looking at names of different Buicks, the word sky, as it applied to and is commonly like attached to the afterlife, I just like that idea of like a skylark, a bird in the air.
yeah. Okay, I thought there might have been some more significance to it, but no, that's fine. Okay, no worries.
Well, I'm sorry to disappoint you.
That's all right. No, that's one question answered. That's fine. That's good.
I will say this: there is a lot of symbolism in the show, and a lot of it is intensely personal, and I wouldn't even talk about it.
Yeah.
I think right now, but a lot of things mean something else. And if you ever just want to go down a rabbit hole, names sometimes, like Dristan means sad or depressed. That's just one kind of like small example. So there's some other stuff in there, but the Skylark is not. Can't believe you picked that one.
Yeah, that's surprising, because I do see a lot of symbolism, and each, apart from it being a fun show, there's obviously a message in a lot of what you're saying, and there's correlations between what you do in your main show and even in Desert Skies FM, with in particular Tristan with the songs, and Mac talking about sadness, and writing a song on one of the Desert FM shows as well. There's that correlation between the two. But I can tell there's a lot of you in the stories that you're telling in the show, and that's what makes it really interesting as well. Apart from being just a fun show to listen to, so yeah. But I picked the Skylark, the only thing that doesn't have any real significance. So oh well, that's the way it goes.
I love it.
Well,
sorry, Marv.
Actually, Darren, you've just reminded me of a point I was going to come out with earlier. That I've suddenly remembered what I was going to say, which is that, in a way, and I've realised this recently, one of the things about podcasting is that, in a sense, a lot of podcasts, specific or especially for people who do independent shows, it's them personally, themselves. It's like an extension of themselves in a way, or a way of themselves bringing something from them or getting something for themselves in a way, much as you do with your show, where you are, like you said earlier on, thinly veiled. I suppose to yourself it would be. I don't think everybody notices it, but it's almost as a way of looking into yourself, and almost like a self-help, essentially.
Yeah. And it's why I would recommend to anyone. We tend to classify people as creatives and otherwise, and I don't think that that's true. I think everybody has an element of creativity in themselves. Just the way that plays out is very different. And I think one of the things that Tendi says to Driston in that episode, after, for those who haven't heard, like he's a songwriter and he sings a really sad song, and he doesn't feel like that's doing a benefit to the world. And one of the things that Tendi says is, when somebody paints a sad picture or writes a sad song, it's often because we can't find the words to convey how we really feel. And so I think art, especially when we allow ourselves to be a little more abstract and a little more free with it, really can be just a wonderful way to to express that part of yourself, which, I don't know that expression's even the most powerful part. It's honest. It's something honest. And I think you're right, Marv, in terms of the it being indie creators. I think it's definitely a lot easier for us. I'm not saying that it doesn't exist in other places, but for an independent creator, they do have a lot more freedom to just be a lot more honest. And because we're podcasters, we never have to worry about getting rich. So it's not like we're making money off this anyways. Screw it. Be yourself. Do what you want to do.
I think you've got more chance of doing that than we have.
I started a Patreon, and I've only just now broke even on what I spend on podcasting in a year, and that's not including everything I've spent in the past. So maybe I'll get there. I don't know.
Hello to my 0 patrons.
I'll send some your way.
I was going to ask, actually, it's funny when you talked about with Driston that episode, the long pause. That was actually really that was really thought provoking for me, because I thought about artists, and especially very like indie artists and things like that, are always seen sometimes as tortured souls, and that with art comes a lot of torment sometimes. But I also thought to myself that artists, I guess, also have a chance they have an outlet for that torment, and that that a lot of us don't have. They can write a song, they can draw a picture, or paint a painting, or write a poem. But for anyone that doesn't have that artistic bent, I guess it's not as easy to deal with that sadness sometimes. So I guess there's pros and cons, but it's always usually the artist is painted as the tortured soul, the so close to genius, but also so close to destruction, self-destruction. So but it always that's what I took out of that episode. Actually, I was a little bit jealous of the artists.
I mean, if I could give you any encouragement, like, I don't think that I would have ever called myself an artist by any means. Like, I was a corporate operations leader for a long time, and just that part of you can die a little bit, I think, when you kind of forget. I mean, I'm sure when you were a kid, you drew a picture, right? Like everybody does. You glued some sticks
Yeah,
together or whatever.
of course.
Art doesn't need to be great. Uh, it doesn't have to be shared, and it's also something anybody can grow in. And the other thing that I would say is, I live and operate under the opinion, and I think that I'm right, that everyone, because they live on Earth, is a tortured soul, with the exception of a few sociopaths, and that's it. we're,
Yeah.
we're all living in a scary place, and we're all dealing with
Yeah.
hard things, and we all have stuff we have to deal with. So draw a picture.
Yeah.
I'm sure you can do it.
Yeah.
Draw your version of Mac. I always enjoy seeing that, what people think characters look
Yeah.
like.
For me, he sounds like someone called him Gimli once, and I thought the body of Gimli was probably right, but with Dave
Yep.
Mustaine's head. So
Oh, I have to excuse me while I look this up. Dave Must. Who's
Mustaine, yeah, I know. Marv just laughed because he knows who I mean. So
Yeah.
this? Okay, he's an American musician here. Okay, yes. I love it.
yeah, that's who I
yes.
sort of picture.
For me, yeah, and I'm glad that you caught that. I called him Gimli in the first episode because that's absolutely, I think, how I see him, minus all of the traditional Lord of the Rings Middle Earth garb that he's wearing.
Yes. Of course, yeah. Very
I,
good.
I can't believe you've got me trying to draw a picture of what I think Mac would look like.
Oh, I'd love to see that.
Dear me, nobody wants to see this. This is dreadful.
Okay, can I tell you something? So I was playing with a piece of software called Adobe. I think it's Adobe Animator or Character Animator, which is a really nifty piece of software that allows you to create a character in either Photoshop or Adobe Illustrator, and then it can see your movements through the camera, and you animate the character by talking and moving. And so I thought, how fun would it be to make a little video for Twitter that is Mac, and I could do his voice, and I could have him do little announcements or whatever. And as soon as I showed it to my family, all of them said, that is not Mac. And so I decided I would never put out my own representation of Mac ever again. Okay, let's see. Marv's here. What's your childhood trauma?
Let's have a look, Mac.
Yeah, it's Mac.
Marv?
I love it.
Marv, okay.
He's got a little bit of a, I don't know how I would describe his neck. Is that like I would call that maybe a butt neck? You know how there's like butt chins, but that's like a butt neck.
Is it a butt neck? Oh dear. Oops.
No, I love it.
As an artist, you make a fantastic podcaster, Marv. So
yeah, that's right. He reminds that his face in that.
I used to like you.
He kind of looks like Dave Grohl.
Dave Grohl. Dave.
Yes, that's who I see.
Very good.
Yeah, with a strange bottom end.
With a very strange bottom end. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, he's been having too many burritos.
It all goes to your neck on the astral plane. Nobody tells you that.
Very good.
Or does it? I mean, because you're dead. So will you actually put on any weight?
That's a good question. I don't believe that you do.
So you were hinting at earlier on about some audio dramas yourself that you'd listened to, or podcasts that you'd listened to beforehand. So what is your experience with audio drama?
It's interesting, and I'll probably get in trouble for saying this, but I mean, I have a terrible attention span. The older that I get, the worse it seems to be getting. And audio in that respect, not just audio dramas, but podcasts in general, even though I love them, I have a very difficult time. So I'll tell you, one of the first podcasts that I ever got into was Aaron Mahnke's Lore. podcast, and it's just so well done. But I find even then, and this is no fault of his own, he just has such a gentle voice and cadence that I would realize I'd been listening to it for 15 minutes and just enjoying the heck out of it, but had no idea what he was talking about because I'd completely not realized I wasn't paying attention. And so when it comes to podcasts, I have to be audio dramas. I have to be very selective. I'll listen to a lot of my friends' shows. I'll listen to the first episode just because I want to know them better. I want to understand what it is they're trying to make, and they all make something really good, and I want to promote that and be honest in my promotion of it. Not that I have like a massive Twitter following or anything. Most of them have more than me, which makes me jealous. Maybe that's why I don't listen to their shows. I'm jealous of their Twitter following. My closest podcast friend is a man named Wayman Alexander, and he makes a podcast called The Liminal Lands. And The Liminal Lands is the only, probably the only audio drama that I've kept up with pretty religiously since it started.
I started listening to Liminal Lands because of actually listening to your podcast, and you reference Waylon's show actually, and I went and listened to it. So yeah, and he was on a Twitter space that you were hosting one day. So it was really great to hear everyone. I didn't want to speak because it was full of creators, and I was about the only, I think, listener there. So,
that's funny because we always, I really want a bunch of listeners to be there, and it usually just ends up being a bunch of us podcasters. We already all talk to each other all the time, but it's still fun.
Yeah.
That's
very
awesome.
good.
Yeah.
So
but man, there's some good ones out there. I will say I did start listening to one recently that for whatever reason has really jived with my brain, and obviously jived with a lot of other brains, and that's Wolf 359. Fantastic show.
Okay.
Yeah, that's in my list of shows to check out as well. Already in my
highly
feed,
recommend
that.
Yeah.
But, where was I going to go there? I was going to say, so are there any moments from the show that stand out to you, or bits that it is an interesting one, actually? Why don't I reshape that question and say, is there any moment in the show where suddenly something happened and it just meant so much to you, this specific moment while making the show?
Mm-hmm. While making it, probably
or
not.
Anything from the show, that's really stood out to you or meant so much to you.
Like I mentioned, a couple of different things that we've talked about so far. I think will give you some insight. One, when I'm making the show, I'm convinced that I'm making the worst thing yet, right? And that's almost without exception. I think the only episode where I didn't feel like I was making something. No, that's not true. I still felt that way. I was going to say the Corsinopoly episode, something about that. I thought I had a lot of fun making it, but I was really afraid of how it would be received. But most of them,
that game in the shops.
Speaking of game, there is something in the works, and it's going to be a while. But I have a friend, and let's just say that his way of expressing his own angst is through video game development. So there's something down the road.
Please let the game be Battlespheres. I'm sure it'll be something like that.
Oh yes, it'll encompass a lot of things. By the time we're done, it'll be way too big for people to. It'll be bigger than Elden Ring, just in terms of world size.
We need tokens.
Almost certainly, yeah. That'll be the way that I make money off of it. We'll give away a free game and say that you have to have tokens in order to make things happen.
Gotta collect the burritos.
I took 3 months off unexpectedly without giving any forewarning whatsoever, and I still feel bad about that. But every time that I sat down to write, I just had such horrible writer's block, and so by the time that I felt ready to restart, which was in February, which was February 6th. Before I wrote that episode, I sat down and I listened to everything, because my wife said you really need to listen, because I don't keep track of lore. It all lives in my head, which is terrifying. But she said you really need to go back and listen to him. And because, like we talked about, because of how much of it is therapy to me, being fleshed out and through this work, for the first time it connected with me on an emotional level. And I think in particular, the episode with Francis, which was probably the one I was the most worried about how it would be received by people. That one dealt a lot with her relationship with her father. I deal with a lot of parental relationship stuff because I think the relationship between parents and kids are just naturally incredibly hard, but also because I'm a dad and I have 3 young boys. And when you have kids, you're so afraid of screwing up. You have such a limited amount of time, and you know that you're going to screw them up in some way. You're going to do something that they talk to the therapist about when they're older. And so I think about my relationship with my kids a lot. And so listening to that episode was the first time that I'd ever listened to, and it's weird because I'm listening to my own show and I'm doing all these voices and things, but I kind of forgot for a moment. And I, when she's talking about, when she gets the message from her dad afterwards, and he says that he loves her. There's just something about that he loves her and that he was proud of her. There's just something about that just connected with me on a real emotional level. And then I realized what I'm doing to people, and I felt bad because I've had folks that have said, I'm at work, I'm trying to weld, and I'm crying into my mask, and I'm like, oh, I'm sorry for playing with your emotions. Wasn't my intention.
But that's the thing. Like, the story itself is fun, but it's the emotions that you evoke with what you're doing. Especially, like, there's a lot of imagery and interplay between people in terms of friendships and loyalty, and also like Corsinopoly that you made reference to before. He's supposedly this malevolent being, but really he's just a lonely dude that wants to play some games with people, sort of thing, and has this face or this front that's broken down by Tandy and Mac, and just treating him like a person, sort of thing, even though he's super being. But
I want to say something about that really quick. Corson, to me, the reason why I created that character is because I think that one of the worst things that's happening in the world right now is it's too easy for us to, for lack of a better word, not meant to be a pun, but it's so easy for us to demonize people right now.
Yeah.
And I think that's because of the distance and the safety that's been created by the way that we communicate with other people in the world. We don't have to look them in the eye anymore. We don't have to, go next door and ask them for flour. We can do that through DoorDash. Like, these aren't our neighbors. We see people that we disagree with, and we ascribe to them a title like malevolent, and that's just what they are, and they're just reduced to nothing. And I think that's one of the messages that, as I started writing the show, I'm like, I really want to convey this, that we're all a little malevolent, we're all a little benevolent. Sometimes we're more malevolent than we are benevolent, but nobody is one-sided. Like,
it's exactly what I got from that Corsinopoly episode. And I thought I knew what you were trying to do with that, which was, I think you achieved it, which was great. But you totally correct in terms of, we're more connected than we've ever been, but we're also more disconnected than we've ever been. I see that with my kid, and the way they interact with their peer groups and things like that. We'd go out and we'd get on a bike and we'd go get together and we'd go play cricket or something like that. And the kids talk to each other over the Xbox now. And for me, that's not having friends, sort of thing, and interacting with your friends, really. So
and sometimes it turns into that. It's funny, I have a neighbor who lives across the street who actually, the people who ended up being the what do they called it, at a wedding. I don't know if they call them the same thing in Australia or England, but the witnesses, is that what they are? The witnesses at a wedding. Anyways, this couple that he played Gears of War with for years,
Yeah.
drove all the way from Texas to Arizona to
Wow.
but no, I think you're absolutely right. And so that's a conversation that I have with my kids very often, because I see them falling into these traps of, and I do too, all the time.
Yeah.
I'll just kind of accept anything. And there's definitely a lot of things wrong with a lot of people, and there's things that we have to be wary of and in whatever. But at the same time, I just want to acknowledge, like, everybody is a human. Everybody had a mom and a dad, and, you know, potentially their own kids. They're all relating to people in different ways, and not always to take that at sight value.
Well, the other thing is too, with Coulson and that interaction between Tendi and Mac, it was a bit of what you put out is what you get back. You know, they treated him a certain way, and he actually, although he seemed like a figure that was looking for, you know, he was lonely, he was looking for that interaction, but they treated him just like a person, sort of thing, and he appreciated that, and he sort of, you know, they ended up being, I guess, friends. Considering. So that was one of my favorite episodes, actually. So it was really...
That's definitely based on real life experience, I think. Because I struggled with working with someone one time. They were very scary to me, and I think they wanted to come across that way. But I had to work with this person, and my life would be living hell if I didn't figure out how to deal with it. And so I just went and sat down with them at lunch one day. They were sitting by themselves, just went and sat down at the table with them and started talking to them. And we found out that we had a lot in common. And at some point I said, it feels like you have a problem with me. What is it? Because I'd like to, you know, if it's something I can control, I'd like to address it. And they said, I just don't trust you because I don't know you. And I said, well, let's get to know each other. And every 2 weeks for the remainder of the time that I worked there, we got together for 30 minutes around lunchtime, and just hung out. And they ended up becoming a close friend. And I genuinely believe that if we could get better at being kind, and I'm not perfect at this by any means, but if we could get better at being kind to the people who scare us, or even who are mean to us, never to the point where we willingly accept abuse. I don't think that's a good idea.
No.
But when we try to be kind to people who maybe seem a little prickly, I think a lot of times that's just worked out for me really well. And they usually end up being really good friends.
Yeah, and for a lot of people, I think that's just a defense mechanism anyway. So
yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, us
Sorry,
and our
Marv.
defense mechanisms.
It's fine. It's fine. So an interesting side to this that I really like is the fact that the show was going for so long, and then you brought out Desert Skies FM, which doesn't follow the show specifically. It's like it doesn't. You don't have to listen to the show to know you don't have to know what's going on with the main show to listen to these Desert Skies FM. It's like little bits, you know, outside of the main story.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing is you get the relationship between Tendi and Mac in these Desert Skies. And that's what makes it really interesting, is that is that what it is? It's sort of like the continuation of their friendship and how they are as people with each other. It's looking more into that.
Yeah, I think when I created Desert Skies FM, I wanted something that people could listen to on the way to work. I wanted it to be a commute. And again, coming back to, I don't want them listening to political radio. I don't want them listening to anything that's incredibly stressful, because work is already stressful, right? So it's like they're headed to work, or maybe they're at home and they're making breakfast before they get started or whatever. I just wanted something that they could listen to and feel like these are friends. These are gentle conversations. They're deep conversations, but also funny, that could just kind of like lift people lift people up. I know some folks put those on when they go to sleep, similarly to the other ones. They'll just put them on their headphones, and they drift off halfway through the second episode, which is really cool to me. They're incredibly low lift, which is really nice. So they're because of the format, I don't have to worry so much about audio quality, because it's meant to sound like it's coming through a radio. No panning, no additional sound effects for the most part. So they're very simple to write and to record, which is good. And then the other thing that I wanted to just kind of convey with that is things aren't always happening on the astral plane. Like, these guys have dealt with millions of travelers, millions upon millions. And though for them it doesn't feel like that, there's just a lot of time where things are mundane and they're just sending out messages to folks. And I like to imagine those times, I think, more so than even the plot moving forward in a lot of ways. And it also just kind of drills home, like, this is their job. They're not always interacting with sphere movers and doing all of these wild things. A lot of times they're just sending out broadcasts and trying to keep people safe on the astral highway.
So I thought Darren was going to ask something then.
He was.
No,
I think
I've
he was waiting
actually
for that
just,
question to ask about the Skylark, but now that he knows that it is not important.
I've had to move the phone out of the car at the moment, so sorry if it's not great audio quality at the moment, guys. But
no, it's fine.
I think Darren's question is if anyone knows where you can get a Buick Skylark from.
Good luck, Darren, because I originally planned to create a patron tier that was going to be $10,000. I will find you a Skylark and drive it to your house and deliver it to you. And I realized that would be very difficult to do. There, for a 1986 Buick Skylark, there's not a whole lot of them still running in good condition out there, which is in part, again, why it's so funny, I think, in the show, that I've made them a perfect car that cannot break.
Very good. I was going to ask, what with Weiwei,
Mm-hmm.
why naming a coyote or a coyote Weiwei?
Yeah, so Weiwei,
Where did that come from?
He's actually based on an ancient Aztec god named Huehuecoyotl. And Huehuecoyotl is the god of dancing. He's a bit of a prankster. He's very powerful. He's also like the god of promiscuous intercourse, which is really funny to me, which I've alluded to somewhat in the show. Non-discriminatory. He just likes to do that kind of stuff. So yeah, that's where he came from. I generally try to choose names that have some sort of significance in terms of like ancient religions and different things when it comes to sphere movers, because they're supposed to be gods, in some small respect.
I might be out of line asking this question, but I thought I'd ask it anyway. You can always cut this out, Marv, if you're, especially if Jared doesn't want to answer it. But considering what Desert Skies is, do you have a concept of the afterlife yourself, or are you a religious person, or?
Yeah, I think I definitely have at different points had different concepts of the afterlife. I consider myself a religious person, like I would say, and I probably differ from a few, if not many, of my listeners in that regard. I'm hopeful that there is an afterlife. I have a really difficult time believing that this consciousness could end. And what exactly that afterlife looks like has definitely morphed over the years. I think as a child, it was very simplistic. It was spirits in, clouds playing harps and wearing robes. The vision of an afterlife that many of us have had. And And I think over the years, as I've just thought about it a lot more, I just can't imagine that the complexity of life would suddenly disappear and that we'd be left with this overly simplistic and mundane and bland afterlife, should we have one. The show, though, was never meant to be a religious story. And so as far as
No, I
Desert
didn't mean that.
Skies is, yeah, definitely. And I don't think people have ever actually taken it that way. Like it's more so meant to serve as a tool.
Yeah.
By making folks dead, which is just a weird sentence. By making folks dead, I'm able to take them outside of the activity of their present life, which is where we miss so many things. I'm convinced that if there is an afterlife, that one of the wildest things will be the hindsight that we're suddenly gifted with, the ability to look back and see the totality of our life. And I'm sure there will be some beautiful things there, but there's also going to be some regrets. And so by having the story take place in the afterlife, there's already some finality in terms of what people are dealing with. They're looking back on it and how could I have dealt with it differently, which presents an opportunity to see, like, how can we deal with that feeling now that there's no control over it, but also to somewhat like inspire people, take action now. I had a guy who said, in very colorful language, he's like, that that an episode had hit him really hard, and he said it just made him think he needs to go hug his kids. And that's awesome. I love that when people decide not just hugging their kids, but restoring relationships that are broken now, because you can hold a grudge forever and you think it's going to get easier someday to let it go. It's not. It gets worse. Do you really want to carry that into do you really want to carry that out of this life with you? Do you really want to be on your deathbed someday and be regretting the fact that you can't change that now? So that's the vehicle that kind of helps out. Death and the afterlife is kind of the vehicle that allows that to happen in the stories. What about you? I want to turn it back on you now. Do you think there's an afterlife?
Damn, didn't expect that one. Probably not. I'm not as hopeful or as optimistic, unfortunately. Grew up in a household with a non-practicing Catholic grandfather who was probably what you'd call a man of science, and because of that, had a very big influence on me, and then obviously independent thought as well. I pretty much I've come to the accommodation with what there probably isn't after we die, unfortunately. But I'm married to a woman who is, I won't say devoutly religious, but she has faith. So we have discussions about that, and there's been periods in my life where I've always thought, well, maybe there is more, and I'm very curious about the paranormal and things like that. I love that sort of stuff anyway. And not just for entertainment, but also to see whether or not there's anything there with any legitimacy as well, that will actually prove that there is something more. And I'm quite open to there being something else, and I hope it's like Desert Skies.
That reminds me of probably one of my absolute favorite horror films, which is 1408 with John Cusack. Yeah, and how for him that's why he goes into paranormal research. Is he doesn't believe in it, but he wants to. And I think it's funny, if you growing up in a religious context, it was oftentimes used to kind of scare people to live your life. They'd tell them, live your life as though there's an afterlife, right? Because you had something to be afraid of, which I think is the terrible thing to communicate to people. But also at the same time, I think there's a benefit to, even if we think differently, on this specific topic, I think there's a benefit to also considering what would it look like to live my life like there is no afterlife. And I think that would, at least if you're in a good place, I feel like that would inspire you to deal with stuff now instead of feeling like more immediately, instead of feeling like, well, I have 1,000,000 years or 1,000,000,000 years to do this. I can always get to it later. And for those of us who are procrastinators, that's not always helpful.
Definitely. Look, it's funny with I don't consider myself, like I said, a religious person at all. But there are a lot of tenets to Christianity that in terms of the way you deal with people and the way you interact and do unto others and things like that, which I think are nearly absolute truths. That you can live your life by, but unfortunately, the rest of the world, there's a lot of people that don't live their life by those tenets, and that's where we come unstuck. So, but yeah, I'm not a massive fan of organized religion. I have seen, my opinion has been used a lot of times throughout history as a tool of, asserting power. So, but it's probably not a popular opinion, but it is what it is.
Anybody who wants to pretend like there isn't things to deal with in terms of what we claim to believe and how we actually behave towards people is lying to themselves. Because there's religion at its best can be a powerful tool, but in the wrong hands it's very dangerous.
100%. Yeah, it can be, look, it can be salvation and hope for some people, but it can be, like you said, it can be a tool for suppression and oppression from others. So depending on how they want to wield that power. So absolutely, for sure. Gentlemen, on that note, I have to leave. Unfortunately, I'm sorry, Marv, and sorry, Jared.
That sounds a little that sounds a little foreboding. We're talking about the afterlife, and you have to leave. What exactly do you mean, Darren?
Well, there's a Buick Skylark backed up behind my car at the moment, and
oh goodness, and you see a coyote off to the side. Things are not looking good.
No, someone didn't send me the memo. So,
well, it was really nice talking to you.
Yeah, it's been fantastic, and apologies, Marv, too. I did say I probably only got about an hour though, but I'd love to speak to you both again in the future sometime, and maybe I could even Jared, if you, I'd love to have you on the show one day as well, my show. But I won't promote that too much, considering I'm on Marv's show. So I'll let you have a fantastic rest of your conversation with Marv, and I'll just slip out the side door.
Before you go, Darren, just let people know where to find you.
MyGuestListPod.com. Pretty much go to the website and all my link tree on Linktree, My Guest List Pod. Everything's there. But MyGuestListPod.com has pretty much got it all. And I'll thank you very much for inviting me on, Marv. That was very, very gracious of you. And you knew I was really invested in Jared's podcast. So I really want to thank you for inviting me on. So it's been fantastic actually speaking to you both, and finally getting to speak with Jared and not just lurk in his Twitter spaces.
We'll let you get on we'll let you get on with your traveling.
All right. Thanks, guys. Have a good day.
Take care.
You too.
So what advice would you give to anybody then starting a podcast of their own?
Don't Google how to make a successful podcast. Avoid all of that like the plague. If it's written by someone who's actually been successful, which it hasn't, but if it has been, you're not them, and you won't be successful for the same reasons as they are. And also they only define success by numbers and your ability to monetize your show, which is near impossible. And I will say this, and I don't mean to like make anybody lose heart if that is their hope, but you are at the whim of algorithms. By and large, you're going into a huge pool of other audio dramas and podcasts and of all various sorts. And depending on a certain type of engagement and a certain type of way that people listen, your show may get shown to others and it may not. Don't let that discourage you. Just make the thing that you really want to make and enjoy making it. Anytime that you see a 20-year-old, because I was one, 20-year-olds, I'm not putting you down by any means, but anytime you see somebody who's brand new to like podcasting, this industry, life in general, come out and try to act like they're a guru when it comes to podcasting, just shut that noise down right away. The number of times that I've heard this genre is dead, nobody wants to hear this, too many people are doing this. No, absolutely not. Somebody says there's too many horror podcasts out there. Yours might be completely different. Yours might be better than 99% of them.
Yeah.
There's a lot of bad stuff out there. There is a lot of somebody got a microphone and they just made something, and that's not putting them down at all. That's what they wanted to do. Go out, do what you're going to do, put your whole heart into it. You will find an audience, and it might be an audience of 50, it might be an audience of 100, it might be an audience of 1,000 or 10 or 20. But if you're putting your heart into something that you believe in, there's someone out there who's going to love it. So just do that. Any other advice that I might give? Lean heavily into the podcaster community. From my experience, they're all very, very supportive.
Yeah.
The few that aren't, I've heard tale of, but I haven't met them, so that's good. We've successfully avoided each other. When you are if you're thinking about doing humor but people don't tell you that you're funny, don't do humor. Don't lean on it just because you think it's easy. That can be really cringe. Just do whatever is something you genuinely care about, genuinely love, genuinely want to listen to. Like, would you want to listen to your podcast? And maybe someone who's genuinely not funny would make a humorous podcast that they want to listen to later on. Hey, more power to them. That's great. And also at the same time, take everything that I say with a grain of salt, because I'm new to this. And I'm very fortunate that it's connected with some folks, but I'm really not in a position to give that great of advice, more so than just do the thing that you really want to do and do it to the best of your ability, and it'll work out.
Well, as you've just noticed, I mean, what you were saying about making friends with other podcasters, even in the same genre, you know, Darren does a similar type of show to me, where he speaks to podcasters about their shows.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of my best friends online in the podcasting world are people who make similar sort of shows. Shout out to Ariel Nissenblatt, who very famously does shows about shows and is a really good podcaster as well.
Mm-hmm.
So what sort of podcast do you like to listen to yourself?
I love investigative journalism. I'm not a huge fan of true crime, though I've listened to some of those in the past, and I did find some of them very engaging. But I don't like the way that I feel. Generally, I'm not able to like separate myself from that stuff very easily. But not that I'm committing crimes and I relate to the the person committing the crimes. But the ones that I listen to, like there's one from Public Media that came out not too long ago that a friend just recommended, and I was enthralled, called Sold a Story, which is talking about the way that we changed how we teach reading in the US and what a catastrophe it's been for young folks. And just investigating, like, how did that happen? Why have we still not fixed it? Stuff like that is just so interesting to me. And I love NPR style, public radio style voices. Those or accents like yours are some of the most pleasant sounds, I feel like, out there. So yeah, anything from folks in the public media space just tends to really jive with my brain.
Well, luckily this isn't going out in visual form because I'm very red-faced after that. So where can people find you and get hold of you then, Jared?
Primary place is desertskiespodcast.com. Basically everything you could think of is there. But then also I'm on Twitter, handle at Desert Skies Pod. And I love hearing from people, and I love interacting with them on Twitter. So I highly encourage folks to meet me there.
That's great. Anyway, thanks for speaking with me today, Jared.
Thank you. This is my first request for an interview, and I hope they're all like this, because you may have set me up in some way to be disappointed in the future. Maybe they're terrible, these other podcasts. I don't know. Not that I'm receiving a bunch of invitations, but this has been really, really pleasant. And really, really fun just to be able to talk to you.
I think it's an important show, like we were saying, during it. I think there's a lot of positives in the show, and there's more to it than it just being an audio drama. It's got a lot of good messages therein that I think a lot more people need to listen to it and get something from it, I think.
Well, thank you for that.
Anyway, you can get hold of Pods Like Us at on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. And you can also, what was I going to say, contact us through podslikeus@gmail.com. I say us, there's only me, really. But anyway, thank you everyone for listening, and hope you listen again to another episode of Pods Like Us.